I believe I would have said the exact same thing at the beginning of the third period of AP World. The trade routes that had existed in the classical era, and now the trade routes that existed in the post-classical era, are continuing to be an important connection between societies in this early modern era from 1450 to 1750. So those trade routes that have long existed, they're the same ones. The Indian Ocean trade network, and the Silk Roads, and the Mediterranean trade network, and the Trans-Saharan trade network. Those trade routes, those regional trade routes connecting to neighboring regions are going to continue to exist. They don't change. That's a continuity, right? And the goods that are being traded on those trade routes, those remain a continuity from earlier times. So spices on the Indian Ocean network, and porcelain and silks on the Silk Road, and gold and salt and slaves being traded across the Trans-Saharan trade network. And on the Mediterranean Ocean, on the Mediterranean Sea, olives and wine and cotton and grains making their way across that trade network. Those goods being traded and the routes remain the same. But what changes in this early modern era, what's going to change in this early modern era, is we're going to get some new players being involved in these trade routes that weren't previously. And that largely points to Western Europe, all right? Western Europe is going to get more involved in now what we can call global trade networks than they had in earlier times. For example, Christopher Columbus' journey to the west for Spain, and the Spanish Empire growing into what is going to be known as New Spain, is going to connect the Americas to the rest of the world. So, boom! New trade route. This what's known as the Atlantic system, or the Atlantic trade route. Never existed before. Now it's brought in connection with the old world, right? Sub-Saharan West Africa. Here's the Sahara Desert. Sub-Saharan West Africa that previously traded mostly with North Africa across the Trans-Saharan trade network, or connected across the Saharan Desert into the Middle East, primarily trading slaves in that direction. Trans-Saharan trade network is going to be dramatically impacted as West African states will begin to be brought into the Atlantic system. And over time, those West African people will start to trade more with European powers over the Atlantic than they will with Northern African or Middle Eastern powers. European states, starting with Portugal, but eventually Spain and England and France are going to get involved in the Indian Ocean network. If we recall, it was primarily Muslim merchants in the Indian Ocean trade network from the Middle East connecting the East African coast, and what do we call that? The Swahili coast, to India. But now European powers, starting with Portugal, but others are going to follow, are going to disrupt that trade network and change that trade network. And we'll see the power of those Swahili city-states and the importance of those Swahili city-states go in decline as the Europeans are going to enter. And we're also going to see the importance of the old city of Constantinople, which we said from early on in this class when we talked about the Roman Empire first establishing a second capital in that city of Byzantium. Constantinople has a tremendously important location in terms of interregional trade. Constantinople is the conduit between Europe and Asia. All right? Constantinople is the conduit between Europe and Asia. But as we talked about in 1453, what happens to Constantinople? It falls to the Ottoman Empire. And now that the Muslim Ottoman Empire is in control completely, not only of the city of Constantinople, but of all the lands of the Middle East, North Africa, like what is today Egypt, and then what is today Israel and Jordan and Syria and Iraq, and obviously up into Turkey. Now that the Ottoman Empire controls those lands, those Christian empires, especially Portugal and Spain, who feel a special place in their heart against Islam. Because if you recall, the Iberian Peninsula was once controlled by by an Islamic State. They have a special place in their heart to spread Catholic Christianity, often at the expense of the Islamic world. They're not fond of the Islamic world. So they don't want to go through the old trade routes, the old land trade routes that the now Ottoman Empire controls. They'd much rather find a different way around. Portugal does it first, and then Spain follows suit. So they will circumvent the land routes, leading to a decline in importance in regards to trade of not only the Ottoman Empire, but also the Silk Road. As more and more goods are going to be traded on the open seas by European powers, that's less going over land routes of the Silk Road. So all of those old trade networks are going to still exist, but they're going to be impacted by the changes that this period brings. Good? Good. That's 411. Now we have 412. Yes? All of those originally existing trade routes will still continue to exist. So that is a continuity. But a change now is the changes that European powers entering these places will bring. For example, in the post-classical era, if we're looking at the Indian Ocean trade network, we're talking primarily about Muslim merchants doing a lot of that business. And we're talking about growing power of the Swahili city-states. Well, Portugal is going to come in and literally blow the doors open with their new ships we're going to talk about in a moment, with their broadside cannon, and they're going to take over these trade routes. So the trade routes will continue, and the goods that will be traded on those routes will continue. But some of the players are going to change, largely exchanging Western Europeans, starting with Portuguese and the Spanish, for the former Muslim merchants. Alex?
So you're saying that when the Portuguese and the Spanish dominated the Indian Ocean trade?
Portuguese initially, and then later other powers are going to come in, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Good? Good. All right. 412 talks about how did these Europeans do it? And largely it comes to new technologies that they will embrace or advance. So we're going to talk first about some new navigation technologies. Now, these are new not in the sense that they didn't exist before this time period, but they're new in the sense that they're getting in the hands of European powers that are willing to use them on the open seas to their advantage. We've looked at one of these before. Well, actually not exactly one of these, but this is an astrolabe. And an astrolabe is an older technology, okay? This has been around for a couple thousand years. And the astrolabe is a way to kind of find out where you are and when you are based on where the stars are. So it originates in the Muslim world, and it's going to eventually make its way into Europe. Someone take a guess as to how the astrolabe makes its way from the Muslim world into Europe. Could be Crusades, but there's actually an easier and an earlier way that it's going to enter. Not the Mongols. Yeah? Not the Silk Road.
The plague.
Not the plague. But here, take this. No. What is the easiest, smoothest transition, easiest way for Islamic stuff, or stuff from the Islamic world to make it into Western Europe, even before the Crusades? It's the Iberian Peninsula. So it's going to enter into Spain, and obviously what becomes in the future Portugal, via the Iberian Peninsula, that Al-Andalus, that Islamic state in Iberia. And it shouldn't surprise us that which kind of people later are going to first be using this technology on the open seas. It's going to be the Portuguese and then later the Spanish. I've got a question over here.
So, like, the continuities that they were already, like, there, like, the technology, but the changes that now Europe is to use?
Sure, we could say that. Absolutely. Absolutely. The Portuguese are actually going to develop this device, which is a little different from the traditional astrolabe. It's called the mariner's astrolabe. A mariner is a guy that goes out on the open seas, right?
Like Tyler.
What?
I don't know what that means, but I'm going to move on. This is the mariner's astrolabe, developed in Portugal to aid people traveling on the open seas. The problem with the traditional astrolabe when you're on the water, when you're on the ocean, is guess what happens when you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean? You're like moving all over the place, right? So when we see these mariner's astrolabes, they're actually going to have a swiveled top. You guys might have seen Mr. Battaglia like walking around, right, with his little triangular platform thing. Have you seen him with this? He's very fond of it. He thinks he's cool, and I know physics better than the rest of the world. No, battalion, they've been doing this for centuries. And essentially, this is what they've created here. So while the ship may be moving, if you're holding on to this top, this swiveled portion of the mariner's astrolabe, guess what? This is going to be stationary. It's the same technology that took Battaglia an extra 500 years to figure out. Also the compass. Now we've talked about the compass making its way, the magnetic compass making its way from China. Thank you, Mongols, bringing that to the West. But many in the Western world who were so steeped on religion thought that this was pretty darn freaky. Like, what's going on? I'm holding this, the needle's moving, and I'm not doing it, I'm not touching it. It must be ghosts, it may be the devil. We should not mess with this thing. Well, the Portuguese initially, again, because they're going to be the ones that have this first push to enter the open seas, the Portuguese are going to say, yeah, could be the devil, or this could be just a really cool tool that kind of uses magnets to help us navigate our way on the open seas. And if it's a small chance that it's a devil, but I've got a big chance of making a lot of money by using this thing to better navigate the open seas, I'm going to go with it's not the devil. I'm going to start embracing this. All right?
It leads them to hell.
So we've got them either developing new or adapting old technologies, or embracing technologies that were there but not previously embraced. All right, we're also going to see some changes in cartography. This is a map. This is the kind of map you would typically see in Europe in the Middle Ages. It's called a TO map, and we can see the T, and we can see the O, and it's centered on Jerusalem, and it divides up the European and African and Asian worlds based on where Noah's kids traveled to. And it has no value whatsoever if you're trying to find your way from point A to point B. All it is it's a religiously, spiritually important map. It says, hey, guess what? Jesus Christ is the center of the world, so we're going to put Christ's home territory in the middle of it and build everything around it. All right? It's a TO map. This is the kind of map of the world you would see in Western Europe in the Middle Ages. And it's virtually useless. But guess what? The Europeans had no use for better maps, because guess what they weren't doing in the High Middle Ages? They weren't venturing out to find other things. Until Portugal says, you know what, we want to start looking around a little bit. We better start learning and actually applying scientific principles to our maps to make them actually useful for us. So Western Europe is going to go from this, which is this TO map, virtually useless except in the spiritual realm, to this. And this is an early Portuguese map of India. And here's India, and here's Sri Lanka. And I don't even know what's going on over here. They're kind of off on this, because Asia certainly doesn't do that. But then you've got the Persian Gulf here, and you've got Hormuz here, and you've got like the west coast of Africa. We got some things going on. So there's some familiarity to this map. Like it is not perfect, but you could actually use this map to kind of say, oh, I get it. Okay, we're going to go to Goa. We're good to go. All right. So better map-making technology, we call that cartography. Better map makers will result in better explorers. All right? Europeans are going to start making better ships that can better travel the open seas. This is the Portuguese caravel. This is the Portuguese caravel. It's lighter, and it's faster, and it's more maneuverable than the traditional ships European powers were using on the Mediterranean Sea, which were traditionally big, heavy ships that were propelled by hundreds of people pulling oars. Kind of the same way people moved around on the Mediterranean Sea in big ships as 1,500 years before. All right? The caravel uses a large mast and put sails on that puppy. And notice this sail in the back. And notice this sail right here. Not like these sails. These are rectangular sails. But notice these sails. Does anybody see anything?
Triangular seal.
They're triangular sails. Called Lateen sails, very good. Who was using the lateen sails long before the Portuguese developed their caravel?
Latinos.
Not Latinos, but that would be more easy for us to remember. Indian Ocean Trade, and Muslim merchants on the Indian Ocean Trade Network using their ships called dhows, D-H-O-W-S. They embraced lateen sails. Why are lateen sails of benefit?
They can go anywhere.
Very good. They can tack better against the wind. So if you have to sail into a wind, you just pull down these sails and rely on your lateen sails. Okay, they can help you. You're not going to go as fast sailing into the wind, but it can be done. So you can tack against the wind. So better ships. This is the Portuguese caravel. Later, the Spanish would enhance that and develop what is known as the galleon, a Spanish galleon. This is your Pirates of the Caribbean stuff. So the Spanish galleon, even bigger than the Portuguese caravel. This is typically multi-decked. You're usually like 3 or 4 decks, and with multiple masts on this. So you might have 2, 3, maybe even 4 masts on a Spanish galleon. These become the primary, it's just bigger. It's just a bigger ship. These become the primary ships of the Spanish fleet. And then both the caravels and the galleons, can't make them out on these pictures, but they're going to start putting some holes in the sides of their ships. And they're going to put cannons on their ships. And we call these broadside cannons because they're on the broad sides of the ships, the wide side, the broad sides of the ships. And the Spanish and the Portuguese will start arming merchant vessels. So rather than making trade deals in the traditional way that trade deals were made, how much do you want for this? Or we're going to trade this? Or we're going to be in competition trade-wise with you? The Spanish and the Portuguese would bring militaries to these trade deals. And they would literally try to blow open the doors on Indian Ocean trade networks.
Did they like rescue a lot of Muslim merchants that were Christian?
Absolutely. We'll talk about that in a minute. Portuguese first, and later other Spanish explorers and other European explorers would also gain better understandings of winds and currents. And they would adapt to the environment. For example, the Portuguese learned that it wasn't always the best and most efficient way on the open seas to travel in a straight line between 2 points. If you could venture out a little bit in order to catch some winds or catch some ocean currents, you would get to your destination even faster. That's why Vasco da Gama, when he's making his way around the southern tip of Africa, actually skirts South America. All right? You would think it would be in a straight line would be the best way to travel, but he's going to skirt around the southern tip of Africa so he can catch these winds off the coast of South America. And then those are going to help speed him to travel around Africa. So harnessing the winds to better travel. Good? Good. 6 minutes left. We can do this. All right. Our third standard talks about some new transoceanic maritime activity. All right. Kind of already talked about all of these things, but let's repeat a couple. First, China. China is earlier than the European nations are going to be doing it. In the early 1400s, under the Ming Dynasty, China will start to venture into the open seas with the largest overseas maritime expeditions. Commissioned by the Ming Emperor, the sailor Zheng He, Z-H-E-N-G-H-E, will go on a series of 7 separate voyages, traveling from East Asia through the Straits of Malacca into the Indian Ocean Trade Network, connecting into the Middle East. He makes it to Ormuz. We've talked about that place before. And all the way down into the Swahili coast of Africa. But Zheng He, with his over 300 ships and over 25,000 men on this expedition, they are not doing what the Europeans are going to be doing. This is not an expedition of conquest. Because why conquer places that have nothing to give you? And according to the Chinese, they need nothing from nobody. They have all the resources they could ever need. They have all the population, the markets they could ever need, right? So Zheng He's expedition is not one of conquest, but it's one of almost showing off. Let's show the world what the Chinese have. And to gain more tributary states. To gain more places that would be willing to give to the Chinese. So it's demonstrating the power of the Chinese, not for exploration or conquest. Like, all of these places that Zheng He's going to, guess what? The Chinese knew about them all. This is not finding anything new. All right? If we look back at this photo, this is one of Zheng He's grand treasure boats, or his treasure ships of Zheng He's fleet. This is a Spanish galleon. And we can see a dramatic difference between the galleon and the treasure ships of Zheng He's fleet. All right? But this is a huge expense for the Chinese. And guess what? They're not bringing in tremendous amounts of new wealth based on the expense that they're spending. And so a later Ming emperor will call off these expeditions and actually scuttle Zheng He's fleet. Just destroy the ship. Hey, guess what? You can't. No one else is going to get an idea to do this again if we just destroy and sink all these ships. So China says, we've really got nothing to gain from the outside world. So why are we spending all this money to do it? Let's stop. And China becomes, during the latter Ming dynasty, more insular, more focused on internal stability than the outside world. Portugal, quite the opposite, obviously. Early on, a guy named Prince Henry gets everything rolling. And you should know Prince Henry. He's driven by two things. Guy loves Catholicism and he wants to spread that. And the guy loves gold and he wants to find that. In 1450, Prince Henry is going to conquer the city of Ceuta. I might be pronouncing that wrong. I apologize. Ceuta in North Africa, just across the coast from Spain. And this gets the Portuguese a foothold in North Africa. Prince Henry will eventually return to Portugal and says, we've got some good things we can do if we get better at traveling the open seas. So he starts a school for navigators, where people from around Europe, but particularly Portugal, can train and learn how to travel the open seas. This is actually where Portugal will design the caravel. They make it. They design the caravel there. And they train future navigators. Later, future Portuguese explorers will venture further south into Africa. And they will start gaining access to West African gold markets. And we will begin to see this disruption in the trans-Saharan trade networks as West African kingdoms will start to trade with the Portuguese rather than trading over the really difficult, expensive trans-Saharan trade network. All right? In 1487, Bartolomeo Diaz is going to sail all the way around the southern tip of Africa. But he doesn't continue that journey. He returns back home. So 11 years later, in 1498, Vasco da Gama makes his way all the way around the southern tip of Africa and into India. And here we have a marked difference between, for example, what Zheng He's expedition was doing with China and what the Portuguese intend to do with the Indian Ocean network. They don't want to merely trade. They want to dominate. And they're going to use these cannon-laden caravels to open up trade markets. They're going to force them open. The Portuguese, in attempting to control the Indian Ocean trade network, will force merchants on that trade network to buy passports from them. In order to pass from one point to another, you better carry a Portuguese passport. And if you don't, we will sink your ships. Or we will take your sailors and we'll mutilate them. We will massacre entire ships worth of merchants, and we will confiscate their goods if they don't carry these passports. And the Portuguese were absolutely doing this on the Indian Ocean. Vasco da Gama. Wonderful Vasco da Gama that my 5th grade daughter learns about how great he makes it around South Africa and makes it to India, right? Well, how does Vasco da Gama treat the Indians that he arrives to? Hindus he's okay with. But the Muslims in India, not cool. And he orders local kings to evacuate Muslims from their kingdoms. And when one refuses and sends an emissary to speak with Vasco da Gama's response is to slice off the man's ears and his lips, because he's not listening and he doesn't want to hear him talk anymore, And they actually sew dog's ears onto the man and send him back to let the Portuguese, let the Indians know how the Portuguese intend to do business, to rule through terror and fear here. All right? So Vasco da Gama did a wonderful thing for the progression of this story of Western European power. But the guy was not a good guy. The guy was not a good guy. Ultimately, the Portuguese don't have enough manpower or a big enough fleet to truly control this network. And we will see eventually England and France and Spain also getting involved in the Indian Ocean trade network.